Welcome back, everyone. The U.S. state of California has some of the strictest gun laws in the United States. Yet legislators there say it's not enough. And that's why lawmakers just passed some new measures aimed at discouraging gun purchases and restricting where guns can be carried. Mark New reports.
Hands up, hands up, hands up.
California has a significantly lower rate of firearms deaths than the rest of the U.S., but there's been an increase in gun violence in recent years. That's partly why in September, the state's Governor Gavin Newsom signed into law a number of gun control measures, including an 11% tax on the sale of guns and ammunition on top of what the federal government already taxes. The money will be used to pay for more security at public schools and violence prevention programs.
The health-related costs, the cost borne by the taxpayers for gun violence is off the charts. Any fiscal conservative should be making that case. The cost of prosecution, defense, the cost of incarceration of people involved in gun violence is extraordinary.
California is the first U.S. state to implement a special tax just for guns and ammunition.
This is an attempt by the governor to, first of all, incentivize individuals to perhaps use a cost-benefit analysis and determine whether or not they truly need to lawfully purchase the weapon. And in doing so, it's going to increase the cost of doing business, not only for the manufacturers, but also the retailers. But then we also have to remind ourselves that no matter how much money is acquired by this additional 11% excise tax, it won't necessarily speak to those individuals who might very well be motivated to engage in gun-related offenses. They steal the firearms or they acquire them through nefarious means.
Governor Newsom also signed into law Senate Bill 2, which increases the minimum age for carrying a concealed weapon from 18 to 21 years old. It also bans people from carrying guns in numerous locations, such as parks and playgrounds, schools, churches, government buildings, public transit, and places where alcohol is sold. That's only a small part of the list. The California Rifle and Pistol Association has already filed a lawsuit claiming the net effect will be to disarm the lawful. In fact, last year, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in a 6-3 decision that people in a number of states have a right to carry a concealed gun in public for self-defense.
The California Supreme Court will have no problem affirming the constitutionality of these particular laws. But when they're challenged in the Supreme Court of the United States, I predict the opposite result. As flaccid as an attempt though this might be, it will certainly place this issue at top of mind so that we might be able to discuss it in the highest courts.
Among the gun laws just passed is also the requirement that semi-automatic pistols sold in California use microstamping technology, which etches unique identifiers on expended cartridges. According to Woods, that not only helps law enforcement trace shooting suspects, but could also open a litany of liability for individuals who purchase firearms. Mark New, CGTN, San Jose, California.
For more on California gun law and tax, I'm now joined by Dru Stevenson, professor of law at South Texas College of Law in Houston. Dru, thanks very much for coming on. I certainly appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay.
I'm honored to be here.
Anytime we talk about weapons anywhere, it's such a polarizing topic nowadays. And California's measure will, in essence, double the tax on firearms and ammunition that's purchased in that state. Even though Mark New, in this very excellent story, talked about some of where that money is going to go, kind of detail me a little bit more where it's going. And obvious question, what are people saying in California?
Well, the same law that imposes a tax creates a gun violence prevention and school safety fund. So instead of the taxes going into the state general revenue, all of the revenues from this tax will go into this designated fund, and which is projected to be about $160 million a year. The first $75 million of that is designated to go to violence intervention programs. So community programs that seek to work with gangs or gang members or people at risk for violence. And then there's allocations after that for other programs like the Judicial Council to have firearm relinquishment programs, and to step up enforcement and other areas and to provide schools with more funding for school security.
And Drew, in the story, we can kind of guess what those who support lawful ownership of firearms are going to say, as opposed to people who are supporting something like this. Not saying you can't be both, but the money goes where, and how do you believe that this measure could make California safer? Safer schools, safer parks, safer public transportation?
Well, in recent years, there's been sort of a growth in these programs to do community violence intervention and prevention, to work with the communities that are affected by violence. And a number of these have been shown to be very effective. And so the lack of funding is often the problem. So having more funding for those can really make a difference. And of course, providing schools with more funding to increase their school security, to have better systems for creating a response if there are guns brought on campus, and so forth, can also reduce the fatalities and save lives. So you are correct that most industries and lines of business, they oppose new regulations and new taxes on their line of business, and the gun industry is no exception. They're pretty absolute about it. I will say, though, that the measure gun control is very popular with most people in California, and this law passed with an overwhelming majority in both houses of Congress. So this wasn't, I'm sorry, of the state legislature. Right. And so this wasn't something that Governor Newsom did unilaterally. Sure. This came from the legislature and had broad support.
You know, it's amazing because geographic locations in the United States, for our international friends, really play a big part in this. Years ago, I was doing a story, and the gun maker Beretta, which had been in Maryland, was shutting down simply because it didn't like Maryland's gun laws. It's very difficult to buy a pistol here, and they moved to Tennessee, which is very open to gun laws. What are the manufacturers saying about a measure like this, where it's going to make it harder to buy a gun, more expensive to buy ammunition, and also much more difficult to get a concealed carry permit?
Well, in terms of the tax, it's always a question about how much an excise tax will actually affect sales. In theory, there's some effect at the margins, but the fact is California has a lot of these excise taxes on gasoline and alcohol and cigarettes and cars and tanning salons, cannabis dispensaries, and it's a little hard to predict whether it really deters people from making the purchases. The question is more a matter of fairness, that maybe those who are participating in an activity like the gun industry should shoulder their fair share of the burden for the social costs. As far as gun companies moving to other states, it's certainly true, and the southern states that are politically friendly towards guns it's not just a friendly atmosphere, they offer tax incentives and other things to try to induce gun manufacturers to move to their state in hopes that it will create jobs.
And you, I should point out, are from the great state of Texas, where guns are just universally accepted almost, it seems to me. Do you believe that other states are going to follow California, or is it, like you said, California is much more open to the idea of gun control?
I think a few states like Connecticut and New York, New Jersey are likely to follow, especially after the challenges to this law make their way through the courts. I think it's a little unclear what's going to happen in the courts, especially with the tax, because we've had a federal tax almost identical to this for 100 years in this country. Wow. It was challenged repeatedly in the courts and upheld early on. It is true the Supreme Court has changed somewhat, but it's not really clear that they would strike down a law like this. So if it gets upheld by the courts, I could see a few other states that also have tough gun control laws like New York and Connecticut adopting something similar. But states like Texas and Alabama and Louisiana and Tennessee will probably go in the opposite direction. If anything, a lot of these states have a weekend a year where you can buy guns without even paying the normal sales tax on the purchases. So it will end up there will be a lot of variety on a state-by-state basis.
And for our international friends, I really feel obligated to point out that a lot of these states also really, their fathers and grandfathers, they really focus on gun control as well. I grew up in one of those states, and my family never owned a gun, but all my friends did, and they really went through this. But you talked about the federal government just a moment ago, and one thing I'd like to point out, I read, trying to find something about the federal government and this. I read one quote from Joe Biden that said, "It just seems like common sense." Do you think the federal government in any way is going to try and follow this? Because there have been so many attempts and failures at reining in gun ownership in this nation.
Well, as I said, we already have a federal law that's a 10% excise tax on handguns and an 11% excise tax on ammunition and long guns. And we've had that for about 100 years. And that money also is earmarked. It goes for wildlife conservation and to give grants for sports shooting competitions and things like that. Again, it doesn't go into the general revenue of the Treasury. I could see at some point, if the Democrat Party controlled both houses of Congress and there was a Democrat in the White House, that they could increase the tax rate somewhat. But that's not usually one of the first types of gun control measures that people are talking about right now.
Dru Stevenson from Houston, Texas. We can't thank you enough and hope to chat with you more about this down the road. Thank you again.
Sure. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.